Hello, it's great to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romance stories, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any. The air in Laramie's Lucky 7 saloon was a thick, suffocating stew of cheap whiskey, sweat, and desperation. Sawdust, stained dark with spilled liquor and mud, clung to the boots of every cattleman, prospector, and drifter packed into the room. A tinny piano in the corner fought a losing battle against the cacophony of boisterous laughter and angry shouts. At a back table, shrouded in a haze of blue cigar smoke, the only sound was the soft, deadly whisper of playing cards sliding across worn green felt. This was a table of high stakes, and Bartholomew's world had shrunk to the 5 cards clutched in his trembling hand. Sweat beaded on his brow, tracing paths through the grime on his temples. His shirt, once a respectable white, was now a map of his failures, stained yellow at the collar and splattered with something he prayed was gravy. Across from him, a mountain of a man sat with the unnerving stillness of a predator, Frank. The name was a low rumble in the saloons and a fearful whisper on the ranches for 100 miles around. He owned the largest spread in Wyoming, the Double Horn, and his reputation was as harsh and unforgiving as the land itself. Frank hadn't spoken more than 3 words all night. Raise, call, and fold. His face, carved from sun-beaten granite, gave nothing away. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on Bartholomew, not with malice, but with a flat, assessing disinterest that was somehow worse. He hadn't lost a single significant hand. Before Bartholomew lay a pitifully small pile of chips, the last remnants of his meager savings, his pocket watch, and the deed to a worthless patch of scrubland. "High your bet, Bartholomew," Frank said, his voice a low gravel that cut through the saloon's din. Bartholomew swallowed, his throat dry. He looked at his cards. A decent hand, a full house, jacks over 8s. On any other night, against any other man, it would have been a winning hand. But against Frank it felt like holding a fistful of dead leaves against a hurricane. He had nothing left to bet. The last of his money was already in the pot. He was ruined, utterly and completely. A desperate, wild idea sparked in the liquor-soaked fog of his mind. An idea so shameful it made his stomach clench, yet so tempting in its finality. He had one thing left, one thing of value that wasn't his to give, but in the eyes of the law, he controlled it. He pushed his last few chips into the center of the table. "I see your raise," he rasped, his voice cracking, "and I'll raise you again." One of the other players, a portly merchant named Henry, scoffed. "With what, Bartholomew?" "The lint in your pockets?" Frank's gaze didn't waver. He simply waited, a monolith of patience. Bartholomew's eyes darted around the room, a cornered animal seeking an escape that didn't exist. He licked his chapped lips. "I have a ward, my stepdaughter, Lillian." A hush fell over the immediate vicinity of the table. Even the piano player seemed to falter. To bet a horse or a herd was one thing. To bet a human soul was another. Henry looked disgusted. "You can't be serious. That's your late wife's girl, a good girl. She's of marrying age," Bartholomew shot back, his voice rising with a pathetic bravado. "Her hand in marriage, that's my wager. It's worth more than this entire pot. She's strong, healthy, and beautiful." He looked directly at Frank, a pleading, manic glint in his eyes. "A fine wife for a man like you, a mistress for your grand house." Frank's expression remained unchanged, but a flicker of something unreadable passed through his steel-gray eyes. He slowly reached for his cigar, took a long, deliberate draw, and blew a perfect smoke ring that hung in the air between them. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with judgment. The men at the table watched, mesmerized by the sheer audacity of the wager. They had all heard of Frank's coldness, his brutal efficiency in business, and his solitary life at the Double Horn. He had no wife, no family to speak of. He was a man who took what he wanted, and a wife was something a man like him could easily acquire through more conventional, respectable means. Then he spoke. "I accept the wager." The words landed with the finality of a coffin nail being hammered into place. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Bartholomew's face, which had been pale with fear, flushed with a sickening wave of hope. He thought he had found a way out. He thought Frank's pride would make him refuse such a dishonorable bet. He had miscalculated terribly. "Show your cards," Frank commanded. With a surge of adrenaline, Bartholomew slammed his full house onto the table. "Jacks over 8s. Read 'em and weep." A few murmurs of appreciation went through the small crowd. It was a strong hand. For a fleeting moment, Bartholomew allowed himself to believe he might actually win. He could pay his debts, get back on his feet, and Lillian would never have to know the horrifying gamble he had just taken with her life. Frank gave Bartholomew's cards a cursory glance. Then, with no ceremony, no triumphant flourish, he laid his own cards down one by one. 4 queens. The sight of them was like a physical blow. Bartholomew stared, his mouth agape, the color draining from his face. The saloon erupted in a storm of whispers and shocked exclamations. It wasn't just a winning hand, it was a massacre, a statement. Frank raked the mountain of cash and deeds toward him with one large, calloused hand. His eyes, however, were still locked on Bartholomew. Fetch the girl. The command was absolute. It was not a request. Bartholomew felt his legs turn to water. Now? Frank, it's late. Perhaps in the morning. Frank stood up, his tall, broad frame eclipsing the hanging lamp and casting a long, dark shadow over the table. He was a good 6'4", built of solid muscle hardened by years of ranch work. He wore simple, dark trousers, a clean grey shirt, and a leather vest, practical clothes that somehow looked more imposing on him than a tailored suit would on another man. You made the wager. The debt is due now. Defeated, Bartholomew stumbled away from the table and out into the cold Wyoming night. The walk to the small, dilapidated boarding house where he and Lillian lived was the longest of his life. Every step was a drumbeat of his own damnation. He found Lillian in their small sitting room, mending one of his shirts by the light of a kerosene lamp. She looked up as he entered, her face a perfect oval framed by waves of rich auburn hair. Her eyes, a startling shade of emerald green, were filled with a sharp intelligence that always made him feel foolish. She was beauty and grace in a world that had offered her none, and he had just sold her like a piece of livestock. "Bartholomew? You're back early. Did you—" She trailed off, seeing the look on his face. "Get your coat, Lillian," he mumbled, unable to meet her gaze. "You're to come with me." "Come with you where? It's past 10 o'clock. Fear, a familiar companion, began to creep into her voice. She stood, her sewing falling to the floor. "Just do as I say," he snapped, his guilt twisting into anger. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. She cried out, trying to pull away, but he dragged her from the room and down the stairs. The questions and pleas she uttered were lost to the wind as he pulled her through the dark streets and back toward the swinging doors of the Lucky 7 saloon. When he shoved her inside, the raucous noise died instantly. 100 pairs of eyes, curious, pitying, leering, fixed on her. She stood there, her hair slightly disheveled from the struggle, her green eyes wide with terror and confusion. She saw the poker table, the scattered cards, and the monolithic figure of Frank standing beside it. Frank's gaze swept over her, a slow, appraising look from the tips of her worn boots to the top of her head. He noted the defiant tilt of her chin, the fire that flickered in her eyes despite her fear. She was not broken, not yet. He took a step forward, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she had to crane her neck to look up at his face. She could smell the faint scent of leather, tobacco, and the cold night air clinging to him. "I am Frank," he stated simply, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle deep in her bones. "You belong to me now." He reached out, not for her arm, but to gently take the worn shawl from her shoulders. Then, placing a firm, inescapable hand on the small of her back, he guided her toward the door. Lillian was too stunned to resist, her mind reeling, her body moving on pure instinct. She cast one last desperate look back at her stepfather, but Bartholomew wouldn't meet her eyes. He was already slumped in a chair, reaching for a bottle of whiskey someone had left on the table. Frank led her out into the street, where a sturdy black horse and a powerful buckboard wagon were tied. He lifted her onto the seat as if she weighed nothing at all, his touch impersonal but absolute. He untied the reins, climbed up beside her, and with a single click of his tongue set the horses moving. As the wagon rumbled out of Laramie, leaving the mocking lights of the saloon behind, Lillian trembled in the cold. But it wasn't the chill of the Wyoming night that terrified her. It was the silent, stone-faced man beside her, a cruel cowboy who had won her in a poker game, now driving her into a dark, unknown future from which there was no escape. The bedroom door he would eventually shut behind them existed only in her most terrifying nightmares. The journey to the Double Horn Ranch was a silent eternity. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves and the groaning of the wagon wheels were the only sounds that broke the profound stillness of the Wyoming night. Lillian sat ramrod straight, her hands clenched in her lap, the fabric of her simple dress twisted into knots. She dared not look at the man beside her. His presence was a physical weight, a vast and silent darkness that seemed to consume the little space on the wagon seat. The moon cast a pale, skeletal light over the plains, revealing a landscape that was brutally beautiful and terrifyingly empty. It was a land that swallowed people whole, and she was being driven into its heart by a man who had bought her like a sack of flour. After what felt like hours, a shape began to emerge from the darkness. It was a long, low structure, solid and imposing against the star-dusted sky. As they drew closer, she saw it was a ranch house, but unlike any she had ever seen. It wasn't built of rough-hewn logs, but of thick, dark timber and stone, with a long porch and glass windows that glittered like vacant eyes in the moonlight. It was a fortress, built not for comfort, but for permanence and defense. This was Frank's kingdom. He brought the wagon to a halt before a massive stable, swung down with an easy grace and tied the reins. He didn't offer her a hand. He simply waited, his face an unreadable mask of shadows, for her to clamber down on her own. Her legs were stiff and shaky, and she nearly stumbled, but she caught herself on the wagon wheel, refusing to show him any more weakness than she already had. He led her not to a back door, but to the main entrance of the house. The heavy oak door swung open into a great room that stunned her into silence. A massive stone fireplace, cold and cavernous, dominated one wall. The furniture was dark, heavy leather and wood, masculine and functional. A magnificent Navajo rug covered the floor, its intricate patterns the only splash of color in the Spartan space. Everything was impeccably clean, yet it felt utterly lifeless, like a room waiting for people who would never arrive. "This way," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. He led her up a wide staircase to a second-floor landing. Every footfall on the polished wood seemed to announce her shame. He stopped before a closed door and pushed it open, revealing a bedroom. Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment her terror had been building toward. She braced herself, a silent prayer forming on her lips. But the room was not what she expected. It was simple, but large and comfortable. A sturdy bed was covered with a thick patchwork quilt. A washstand with a clean pitcher and bowl stood in one corner, and a small wardrobe in another. A single window looked out over the vast, dark expanse of the plains. It was a far cry from the tiny, cramped room she had shared with Bartholomew. Frank stepped back into the hallway. "This will be your room. You will be expected in the kitchen at sunrise. You will cook, clean, and manage the household. Do not leave the immediate vicinity of the house and stables. Do not speak to my men unless it is necessary. Am I clear?" Lillian stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. He was giving her instructions, like a new housekeeper, not the orders of a master to his property. She found her voice, though it came out as a fragile whisper. "Clear." He gave a single, curt nod, and then he did the one thing she never anticipated. He pulled the door shut, leaving her alone inside. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She stood frozen in the center of the room, listening as his heavy boot steps receded down the hall. He had shut the bedroom door, but he was on the other side. The wave of relief that washed over her was so powerful, it made her knees buckle. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her body trembling with the aftermath of sustained terror. She was a prisoner, a servant won in a bet, but for tonight at least she was safe from the fate she had dreaded. Sleep did not come easily, but when it did, it was the deep, dreamless slumber of pure emotional exhaustion. The days that followed fell into a strange and rigid routine. Lillian was the ghost of the double horn. She rose before the sun, lighting the stove in the large, well-stocked kitchen and preparing a hearty breakfast of bacon, eggs, and coffee. Frank would appear as the sun crested the horizon, eat his meal in complete silence at the head of the long dining table, and then leave for the day. She would spend her hours cleaning the cavernous, empty house, scrubbing floors that were already clean, dusting furniture that no one ever used. It was a gilded cage, a fortress of ice, where the warden was a silent, brooding enigma. His cruelty was not in his hand, but in his silence. He rarely looked at her, and when he did, his gaze was utterly impersonal, as if he were inspecting a piece of equipment. He never spoke to her beyond a one-word command or a grunt of acknowledgement. The silence was a weapon, a constant reminder of her status, an object, a wager won, something less than human. Some days she felt herself starting to unravel, the loneliness a physical ache in her chest. She would talk to herself as she worked, just to hear the sound of a voice. Her only respite was the work itself. In it, she found a small measure of control. She could not control her freedom, but she could control the gleam on the wooden floors, the crispness of the laundered sheets, the savory aroma of the stew she prepared for his silent supper. After a week of this suffocating isolation, she was tasked with fetching water from the well near the stables. As she worked the pump, a voice, soft but clear, startled her. "The buckets are heavy. You should make 2 trips." Lillian spun around to see a young woman standing by the corral fence. She was Native American, perhaps a few years younger than Lillian, with long black hair braided into a single thick plait. She wore practical buckskin leggings and a simple tunic, and her dark, intelligent eyes assessed Lillian with a calm curiosity. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in her surroundings. I can manage," Lillian said, her voice rusty from disuse. The young woman watched her struggle to lift the 2 full buckets. "He does not like things to be broken from carelessness." She walked over, taking one of the heavy buckets from Lillian's hand as if it weighed nothing. "My name is Sunbeam. I'm Lillian." The words felt strange on her tongue. "I know," Sunbeam said simply. She gestured toward the corral, where a magnificent black stallion was pacing restlessly. "Frank trusts me with his horses. He does not trust many people." Lillian looked from the proud, powerful horse to the calm young woman. "Why do you work for him?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. "My people have an agreement with him," Sunbeam explained, her gaze fixed on the stallion. "This land was once ours. He honors that. He lets us graze our herds in the North Valley, and in return, some of us work for him. He pays fairly. He is a hard man, but his word is stone." Lillian absorbed this information. A hard man, but an honorable one. It seemed a contradiction. She thought of the humiliation in the saloon, the cold way he had claimed her. "He seems cruel." Sunbeam turned her dark eyes on Lillian. There was no pity in them, only a deep, unnerving perception. "There are many kinds of cruelty," she said softly. "The wolf that kills the lamb is cruel, but the trap that lies hidden in the grass is crueler still. Frank is the wolf. You can see him coming." She said nothing more, simply carrying the bucket to the kitchen door and setting it down before turning back toward the stables and the horses that were her charge. Lillian stood alone in the bright Wyoming sun, the meaning of Sunbeam's words echoing in her mind. The trap that lies hidden in the grass. Was it a warning? A riddle? For the first time since her arrival, a sliver of doubt pierced through her fear. She had been so certain of the kind of man Frank was. A cold-hearted gambler, a brute who took what he wanted. But Sunbeam's words hinted at something more complex. He was a man who honored agreements with the Lakota, a man who inspired a quiet loyalty in the young woman who cared for his most prized possessions. That evening, as Frank sat at the table eating the meal she had prepared, she watched him from the shadows of the kitchen doorway. His face was as hard and unyielding as ever. But now she saw not just a monster, but a mystery. She was still his prisoner, trapped in his fortress of ice. But for the first time, she began to wonder not just what he would do to her, but why he had done it at all. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but now it was joined by a new, dangerous emotion, curiosity. Folks, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Write your city and state here in the comments so I can send a shout-out. The first sign of the blizzard was not the snow, but the silence. A strange, heavy hush fell over the plains, the usual cry of the hawk and the rustle of the wind in the prairie grass vanishing into a dead calm. Then the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, a sickly yellow-gray, and the horizon disappeared. The first flakes were small and tentative, but within an hour the world beyond the ranch house windows had been erased by a thick, swirling curtain of white. Lillian watched from the kitchen window as the wind began to howl, a mournful, predatory sound that seemed to claw at the very foundations of the house. Frank and his men had spent the morning securing the livestock, their dark figures moving purposefully through the ever-thickening snow until they, too, were swallowed by the storm. The double horn, once a symbol of her isolation, now felt like the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving into chaos. By midday, it was impossible to see the stables from the house. Snow piled in great drifts against the doors and windows, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. Frank had returned, his eyebrows and the brim of his hat caked in ice, his face raw from the cold. He said nothing, simply stamping the snow from his boots and heading to the great room to stand before the roaring fire he'd built, a silent sentinel watching the storm. Lillian found herself in a state of nervous energy. cleaning what was already clean, checking the supplies in the pantry, her heart thumping in time with the rattling of the window panes. They were trapped. The thought was both terrifying and strangely calming. The world, with all its dangers and judgments, was gone. There was only this house, this storm, and the silent, imposing man in the other room. The crisis came just as dusk was painting the white world outside in shades of deep blue and purple. The back door burst open with a crash, driven by a gust of wind and the weight of two men. One was a young ranch hand named Benjamin. The other was Joseph, one of Frank's senior foremen, who Benjamin was half dragging, half carrying. Joseph's face was ashen, his leg bent at a sickeningly unnatural angle. A dark stain of blood was spreading rapidly through his thick wool trousers. "He fell from the hayloft," Benjamin gasped, his young face pale with panic. "The wind took the ladder. I think it's bad, Mr. Frank." Frank was across the room in 3 long strides, his icy composure instantly replaced by focused intensity. "Get him to the fire. Lay him on the rug. Gently." They lowered Joseph to the floor. He groaned, a low, pained sound, his eyes fluttering. Lillian rushed forward from the kitchen, a stack of clean cloths in her hands, her earlier anxiety vaporized by the immediate, urgent need before her. Frank knelt and took out a pocket knife, carefully slicing the fabric of Joseph's trouser leg away from the wound. Lillian drew in a sharp breath. It was a compound fracture. The jagged white end of a bone protruded gruesomely from the torn flesh. The other men who had been sheltering in the bunkhouse crowded into the doorway, their faces a mixture of horror and helplessness. "Someone has to ride for the doctor in Laramie," Benjamin stammered. "No one's riding anywhere in this," Frank stated, his voice flat and absolute. "He'd be dead before he got a mile. Joseph will bleed out or the fever will take him before this storm breaks." A grim silence fell over the room. They all knew it was a death sentence. But Lillian did not see a death sentence. She saw her mother, years ago, setting a farmer's broken arm at their kitchen table. She heard her mother's calm voice, explaining which herbs were for pain and which were for cleaning a wound, how to pull a bone straight and true. "Whiskey?" she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "And a kettle of boiling water. Now." The men stared at her, dumbfounded. It was the first time she had ever given an order. Frank's gaze snapped to hers. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a steely, focused calm. He hesitated for only a second before turning to Benjamin. "You heard her. Do it." As Benjamin scrambled to the kitchen, Lillian knelt opposite Frank beside the injured man. "I'll need more clean rags and splints, 2 sturdy pieces of wood from the kindling box, about this long." She held her hands apart. "And leather straps, if you have them, from a saddle or reins." Frank looked from her face to the horrific injury and back again. For the first time, he was not looking at the girl he had won in a poker game. He was looking at a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Without a word, he stood and strode over to the wood box, selecting 2 pieces himself. For the next hour, the great room of the ranch house became an impromptu surgery. Lillian worked with a deft, practiced efficiency that was mesmerizing. She cleaned the wound with whiskey-soaked rags, her touch gentle but firm, ignoring Joseph's pained whimpers. "I have to set the bone," she said, looking directly at Frank. "It will be painful. You and Benjamin will have to hold his shoulders down, and someone needs to hold his good leg. When I say pull, you have to pull the leg straight, hard, and steady. Do you understand?" Frank nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. A strange, reluctant admiration was dawning in their grey depths. He positioned himself at Joseph's head, his large hands gripping the foreman's shoulders. The next few minutes were a brutal, sweat-soaked ordeal. At Lillian's command, Frank pulled. There was a terrible grating sound, and a scream from Joseph that was quickly muffled as he passed out from the pain. But Lillian didn't flinch. With steady hands, she guided the bone back beneath the skin, quickly packed the wound, and began to bandage it tightly. She skillfully affixed the splints, securing them with leather straps Frank had cut from a harness. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, her forehead damp with perspiration, her sleeves stained with blood. Joseph was breathing evenly, his color already a little better. The immediate danger had passed. "You've done this before," Frank said. "It wasn't a question." "My mother was a healer of sorts," Lillian replied, her voice tired but steady. "She taught me." He just stared at her, the silence stretching between them. The other men, awestruck, carried Joseph to a makeshift bed near the fire, leaving Lillian and Frank alone in the center of the room. The storm raged on, trapping them in an intimate cocoon of firelight and howling wind. Hours later, After Joseph's condition had stabilized and Lillian had forced some broth down his throat, Frank found her by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He handed her a tin mug of steaming coffee. "Thank you," he said, the words sounding unused and heavy on his tongue. "You saved his life." Lillian accepted the mug, her fingers wrapping around its warmth. It was the right thing to do. They stood in silence for a long moment, the unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "You must think I'm a monster." Lillian looked up at him, her green eyes searching his face in the flickering light. "You won me in a card game and dragged me from my home. You treat me like a possession you've already grown tired of. What else am I supposed to think?" He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the fire, his granite profile etched with shadows. The game was a means to an end. It was ugly. It was meant to be. He took a deep breath. "I was at the saloon 2 nights before that game. I overheard Bartholomew talking to another man, a man named Archibald, who runs a freight business out of Cheyenne. He's not a good man. He has a reputation for collecting pretty things and breaking them." Lillian felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. "Bartholomew was deep in debt to him," Frank continued, his voice a low rumble. "He had no more money, no more property. He was going to sell you to Archibald, not your hand in marriage, you, outright. He was going to have you taken in the middle of the night and delivered like cargo." Her mug trembled in her hands. She couldn't speak. "I knew if I just offered to buy you, Bartholomew would get greedy or suspicious. He'd try to play me against Archibald. If I threatened him, he'd run to the sheriff and play the victim. The poker game. It was public, dishonorable, yes, but it was binding. In front of 20 witnesses, he wagered your legal guardianship and lost. It was the only way I could think of to take you from him, quickly and finally, before he could give you to a man who would have destroyed you." He turned to face her, his winter sky eyes filled with a raw intensity she had never seen before. "I needed the whole town to see me as a cruel, possessive bastard. I needed them to think you were my property, untouchable. It was the only way to keep you safe, to keep men like Archibald away." The entire foundation of Lillian's world tilted. The fear, the humiliation, the quiet hatred she had been nursing for weeks, it had all been built on a lie. He hadn't been her captor. He had been her rescuer. His cruelty wasn't cruelty at all. It was a shield, a brutal, painful, terrifying shield that he had put up to protect her. The howling of the wind outside was no match for the storm of emotions inside her. She looked at the man before her, the cold rancher, the ruthless card player, and for the first time, she saw the cracks in his armor. The blizzard broke on the 3rd day. It receded as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world transformed. The Wyoming landscape was buried under a pristine, silent blanket of white, the sky a brilliant, aching blue. Inside the fortress-like ranch house, the atmosphere had undergone an equally dramatic shift. The fortress had become a sanctuary, and the glacial silence between Frank and Lillian had thawed into something hesitant and fragile, yet undeniably warm. Frank's confession had changed everything. Lillian now saw his actions through a new lens. His distance was not contempt, but a clumsy, misguided attempt to protect her from forming an attachment to her owner. His silence was not cruelty, but the ingrained habit of a man who had long ago locked his own heart away. She moved about the house with a lighter step, her fear replaced by a complex tapestry of gratitude, confusion, and a burgeoning affection that both thrilled and terrified her. He, in turn, began to see her not as a problem he had solved, but as the woman she was, intelligent, resilient, and compassionate. He found himself seeking her out, not with commands, but with excuses. He would ask her opinion on a new horse, or linger over his supper, telling her quiet stories about the land and the history of the ranch. He spoke of his parents, who had built the house with their own hands before being taken by fever when he was just a boy, leaving him to raise himself and build their legacy into an empire. In these moments, Lillian saw the lonely boy still living inside the formidable man. The armor was not just cracked, it was beginning to fall away. One evening, as she tended to Joseph, who was recovering steadily thanks to her care, Frank came and stood in the doorway, watching her. "He'll have a limp, but he'll walk again," Lillian said softly, adjusting the foreman's blankets. "You can't keep a good man down." "No," Frank agreed, his eyes on her. "You can't." He stepped into the room. "Lillian, the game I played, it gave me a legal claim over you as your guardian. That's a claim I have no right to hold. When the path to Laramie is clear, I'll take you to town. You'll be free." I'll give you enough money to start a new life, anywhere you choose. Lillian stood up and faced him, her heart sinking. Freedom. It was what she had prayed for since the moment she was dragged into the saloon. So why did the thought of it now feel like a punishment? The idea of leaving the double horn, of leaving him, left a hollow ache in her chest. "Is that what you want, Frank?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked down at his large calloused hands, then back up at her, his grey eyes turbulent with emotion. "What I want doesn't matter. What matters is what's right. What I did was wrong, no matter the reason. What you did," she said, taking a bold step closer, "was save me. You think I want to go back to a life of scrimping and saving, always looking over my shoulder for men like Bartholomew or Archibald? I have been more respected and safer in this house, even when I thought I was your prisoner, than I ever was as his ward." Her gaze was fierce, her emerald eyes shining. "This ranch, for the first time in a long time, it feels like a home." Before Frank could respond, the sound of approaching horses shattered the evening calm. It was too soon for travelers. Frank's body went rigid, his hand instinctively dropping to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through the glass. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was no longer the hesitant man revealing his heart. He was the master of the double horn, defending his territory. But Lillian followed him into the great room just as the front door was kicked open. Two figures stood silhouetted against the snow-bright twilight. One was Bartholomew, his face flushed with whiskey and greed. The other was a taller, leaner man with a cruel sneer and cold, dead eyes. Archibald. "Evening, Frank," Bartholomew slurred, trying for a confident swagger. "We've come for my property. Seems you've been keeping her warm for me. Archibald here is prepared to be very generous." "She's not your property," Frank said, his voice lethally calm. He moved to stand protectively in front of Lillian. "You forfeited your rights. Get off my land." Archibald chuckled, a dry, reptilian sound. "I don't think so. We have a business deal, your stepfather and I. A bill of sale is already written. The girl comes with us." He drew a pistol, its barrel gleaming in the lamplight. Everything happened in a blur. Archibald raised his weapon, but he wasn't aiming at Frank. He was aiming at Lillian. It was a threat, a way to force Frank to stand down. But Frank didn't hesitate. He shoved Lillian behind him as his own Colt cleared its holster with astonishing speed. A single deafening shot echoed through the room. Archibald staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face before collapsing in a heap. Bartholomew screamed, a pathetic, high-pitched wail of terror. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet and falling into the snow. Frank advanced on him, the smoking gun still steady in his hand, his face a mask of cold fury. "You will leave this valley, and you will never return," Frank commanded, his voice like the cracking of glacial ice. "If I ever see your face again, I will not be so merciful. Now run!" Sobbing, Bartholomew crawled to his feet and fled into the darkness, leaving his fallen accomplice behind. The sudden, violent silence in the aftermath was deafening. Lillian stood trembling, her hand pressed to her mouth, the acrid smell of gunpowder stinging her nostrils. Frank holstered his weapon and turned to her, his face grim. He reached out, his hands gently gripping her shoulders, his eyes scanning her for any injury. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She could only nod, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't a fight over property. It wasn't a gambler claiming his winnings. It was a man risking his life for the woman he... The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, and seeing the raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes, she knew he felt it too. "Lillian," he began, his voice thick. What I said before about you leaving, I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel the powerful, steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "Unless you're asking me to leave." A slow smile, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, transformed his rugged face. It was like watching the sun break through a winter storm. "I'm asking you to stay," he said, his voice deep and certain. "As my partner, as my equal, as my wife." He lowered his head and his lips met hers. The kiss was not rough or demanding, but filled with all the unspoken words, the shared solitude, and the hesitant hope that had grown between them. It was a kiss that sealed not a wager, but a promise. It was the closing of a door on a life of fear and the opening of another into a future as vast and promising as the Wyoming sky. Standing together in the great room of their home, they both knew that the greatest prize had not been won with a hand of cards, but with a debt of the heart, paid in full. True strength is often hidden beneath a harsh exterior, and the greatest acts of protection can be misunderstood as cruelty. One must look beyond appearances and into the heart to understand that a person's true worth is not a wager to be won, but a treasure to be earned through sacrifice and trust. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.